It is the 6th of September, 1522. The air in Seville is heavy, thick with the scent of sun-baked mud from the Guadalquivir River and the persistent salt-heavy heat of a fading Andalusian summer. On the docks, a crowd has gathered, but there is no cheering. There is only a stunned, almost reverent silence. Creaking against the current, a single ship appears. This is the Victoria. But she does not look like a vessel of the Spanish crown anymore. Her hull is a patchwork of rotting timber and gray, salt-crusted brine. Her sails are so thin they look like spider webs held together by prayer. When the anchor finally drops, the men who stumble onto the stone quay are not the proud explorers who left 3 years ago. They are skeletons wrapped in rags, their skin the color of old parchment, their eyes wide with the hollow stare of those who have seen the edge of the world and somehow crawled back. This is the story of a ghost ship and the man who conjured it into existence. We are going to travel back to the moment when the map of our world was finally stitched together. It is a journey that began in the bitter halls of the Portuguese court, fought its way through a frozen labyrinth at the bottom of the Americas, and nearly vanished in the terrifying silence of an ocean that seemed to have no end. We will see how a veteran soldier with a permanent limp and a wounded pride convinced a teenage king to bet the future on a westward shadow. We will witness mutiny under the Antarctic stars, the smell of cloves that cost more than human life, and a battle on a beach that the history books still struggle to explain. You see, before this voyage, the world was a collection of fragments, islands of knowledge floating in a sea of myth. After the Victoria docked that day, the fragments were gone. The earth was finally, undeniably, one. Our story doesn't begin on the ocean, but in the narrow stone-paved streets of northern Portugal, in a village called Sabrosa. The year is 1480. Ferdinand Magellan, the man we know as Magellan, was born into the middle ground of history. He was minor nobility. This meant his family was high enough to have honor, but low enough to have to fight for every scrap of influence they possessed. Imagine a young boy growing up among vineyards and olive groves, listening to the clatter of horses and the stories of soldiers returning from the frontiers of Africa. His father was a tax collector, a man of ledgers and law. From him, Ferdinand learned that details matter. He learned to read, to write, and to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the Portuguese court, where he eventually served as a page. But the real education of Magellan happened in the East. In 1505, at the age of 25, he sailed for India. This wasn't a voyage of discovery. It was a voyage of conquest. For 8 years, he lived the life of a soldier mariner. He felt the humid weight of the Indian Ocean, the sting of gunpowder in the Malabar coast, and the chaos of the siege of Malacca. It was there, in the narrow streets of a city that controlled the world's spice trade, that a spear pierced his left leg. That wound never truly healed. For the rest of his life, Magellan walked with a distinct, uneven rhythm, a clink of his boot that announced his presence before he spoke. It was a physical reminder of his service, a badge of loyalty. But when he returned to Lisbon in 1512, he found that loyalty was a currency the crown was no longer interested in trading. He approached King Manuel I, a monarch who was reaping the rewards of Vasco da Gama's route to India. Magellan asked for a small increase in his pension, a tiny adjustment for a man who had bled for the throne. Manuel refused him, not once, but 3 times. There is a moment in the archives where history feels incredibly personal. Magellan, the veteran, the navigator who had spent years studying the currents of the East, asked if he might find service elsewhere if his own king had no use for him. Manuel's response was a cold, indifferent shrug. He told Magellan he could go wherever he pleased. It was a profound mistake of statecraft. You see, Magellan wasn't just walking away with a limp. He was walking away with a secret. During his time in the East, he had befriended an astronomer named Rui Faleiro. Together, they had pored over secret Portuguese charts and calculated the size of the world. They believed the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, were much closer to the Americas than anyone realized. More importantly, they believed there was a way through the New World, a hidden door to the west that would allow a ship to reach the riches of the East without ever crossing into Portuguese waters. In 1517, Magellan crossed the border into Spain. He was a man with no country, carrying a plan that felt like a betrayal to some and a miracle to others. He arrived in Seville not as a servant but as a strategist. He traded his Portuguese name for a Spanish one, Ferdinand Magellan. But behind the new name was the same iron-willed man, driven by a quiet, burning sense of injustice. He wasn't just looking for a passage to the East. He was looking for a way to prove that the king who had discarded him was wrong. And to do that, he would have to convince a young 18-year-old King Charles of Spain to give him 5 ships and a crew of men who, in their hearts, already considered him a traitor. In the spring of 1519, the city of Seville was the beating heart of the Spanish Empire. If you walked down to the banks of the Guadalquivir River, to the district of Triana, your senses would be overwhelmed. The air was a thick soup of boiling pitch, sawdust, and the sharp, metallic tang of the armories. This was where the Armada de Molucca was taking shape. Magellan was now a man with a royal mandate, but in the eyes of the local shipwrights and merchants, he was still an outsider. He moved through the shipyards with that rhythmic, uneven step, clink, 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 his eyes scanning every plank of oak and every coil of hemp. He knew that out there, in the vacuum of the unknown, a single soft board or a frayed rope was a death sentence. The fleet he assembled was not a collection of gleaming jewels. These were carracks, naus, sturdy, high-walled workhorses designed to carry heavy loads through heavy seas. There was the Trinidad, his flagship, solid and well-armed. The San Antonio, the giant of the group, meant to carry the bulk of the food. Then the Conception, the Victoria, and the smallest, the Santiago, a nimble scout that would eventually be the first to taste the dangers of the South. To the men of the 16th century, these ships were technological wonders, the peak of human engineering. But inside, they were cramped, dark, and smelled eternally of damp wood and bilge water. Magellan packed them with enough supplies for 2 years, thousands of pounds of salt beef, mountain-high stacks of hardtack biscuits, barrels of wine, and even live cows and pigs. But he also packed items for the souls they might encounter, hundreds of tiny bells, mirrors, brightly colored cloth, and iron knives. It was a cargo of hope and manipulation. However, the most volatile cargo wasn't the gunpowder or the wine. It was the men. Among the 240 crew members, there was a simmering intellectual and national tension. Magellan was a Portuguese captain general leading a fleet funded by Spanish gold. The Spanish captains, Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, Luis de Mendoza, didn't just dislike Magellan. They distrusted him. They saw him as a man who had sold his soul to a rival crown. They stood on the decks in their velvet and steel, watching the foreigner give orders, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. On the morning of September 20th, 1519, as the bells of Sanlúcar de Barrameda rang out across the water, the 5 ships caught the wind. Magellan stood on the stern of the Trinidad, looking not at the horizon, but at his own ships. He knew the greatest threat wasn't the ocean ahead. It was the men following him, and as they slipped into the Atlantic, the land behind them vanished, leaving them alone with their ambitions and their ghosts. The first few weeks were a deceptive lull. The Atlantic was kind, the winds were steady, and the crews fell into the monotonous rhythm of life at sea, the creak of the masts, the splashing of the waves, and the nightly prayers led by the friars. They skirted the coast of Africa before turning west, cutting across the blue desert of the ocean toward the New World. By December, the world changed. The biting salt of the ocean gave way to the humid, sweet scent of tropical rain and ripening fruit. They reached a massive, sheltered bay that we now call Rio de Janeiro. For 2 weeks, the expedition was a paradise. The men traded mirrors for pineapples and bells for parrots. They feasted on fresh fish and rested their sea-weary legs on the warm sand. It was a moment of lightness before the shadow fell. As they pushed south, the warmth evaporated. The coast of South America began to change from lush green to a jagged, gray, skeletal landscape. In January 1520, they reached the Rio de la Plata, a massive opening in the land. Magellan's heart must have skipped a beat. Was this it? The passage to the west? He sent ships deep into the mouth of the river, only to find the water turning fresh. It wasn't a strait. It was just a river, another dead end. The disappointment was a physical weight. The weather turned brutal. The roaring 40s, the violent winds of the southern latitudes, began to scream through the rigging. The sea turned into a gray, churning chaos. By March, with winter approaching in the southern hemisphere, Magellan made a hard choice. He pulled the fleet into a desolate, wind-swept bay called Puerto San Julian. "We winter here," he commanded. It was a death sentence for morale. The rations were cut. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence. And on the night of April 1st, the simmering tension finally boiled over. While Magellan slept on the Trinidad, 3 of his ships, the San Antonio, the Conception, and the Victoria, were seized by the Spanish captains. They sent a message to Magellan. They were taking control. They wanted to go home. They called him a failure, but they had underestimated the professor by the campfire. Magellan didn't panic. He played a game of lethal chess. He sent a small boat to the Victoria with a hidden squad of assassins. While the captain, Mendoza, was reading a letter, a dagger found his throat. Simultaneously, Magellan moved the Trinidad to block the mouth of the bay, trapping the mutineers. The next morning, the mutiny was over. But the gore filter of history requires us to look at the cost. Magellan didn't just punish them. He made an example of them. Gaspar de Quesada was beheaded in front of the entire crew, his body quartered as a warning. Juan de Cartagena, the high-born Spaniard, was left behind, marooned on a desolate, freezing beach with nothing but a bit of bread and a sword. The silence that followed in the camp was heavier than the winter snow. Magellan had secured his command, but he had done so with blood. And as the Santiago was smashed to pieces against the rocks during a scouting mission shortly after, the men realized that the man leading them was more terrifying than the ocean itself. They were no longer an expedition. They were a cult of survival, waiting for the ice to melt so they could sail into a void from which no one had ever returned. When the ice finally began to groan and fracture in late October 1520, the remaining 4 ships slipped out of the shadow of Puerto San Julian. The men were quiet. The ghosts of the mutiny still hung in the rigging, but ahead lay a coastline that felt like the end of the world. It was a jagged, vertical landscape of granite and frost, where the sea didn't just meet the land, it seemed to be trying to swallow it. On October 21st, the feast day of St. Ursula, the lookout on the Trinidad spotted a high, pale cape. Magellan called it the Cape of the 11,000 Virgins. Behind it, the water didn't end. It curved into a dark, narrow opening. You see, for decades, navigators had dreamed of a passo, a secret door through the Americas. But as the ships entered, it didn't feel like a doorway. It felt like a throat. The walls of the strait rose thousands of feet above the masts, casting shadows so long they seemed to pull the night into the middle of the day. The wind, trapped between these stone giants, became a physical force, screaming down from the glaciers and numbing the hands of the men until they couldn't feel the ropes. And here, in the heart of this labyrinth, the expedition suffered its greatest blow. It wasn't a storm that did it, but the old poison of doubt. The San Antonio, the largest ship, the one carrying the majority of the fleet's food, simply vanished. Under the cover of a thick Antarctic fog, a pilot named Esteban Gomez, a man who had never forgiven Magellan for his command, turned the ship around. He didn't just desert. He stole the lifeblood of the expedition and headed back to Spain, leaving the remaining 3 ships to face the unknown with half the calories they needed to survive. Magellan waited. He searched the gray inlets for days, but the San Antonio was gone. He was now down to 3 ships and a rapidly dwindling supply of salt beef. A rational man would have turned back. But Magellan wasn't a man of ratios. He was a man of destiny. For 38 days, they crawled through the strait. They saw fires on the southern shore, distant flickering lights from indigenous camps that led them to name the land Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. And then, on November 28th, the towering cliffs suddenly fell away. The water turned from a churning gray to a deep, crystalline blue. Magellan stood on the deck, his face weathered by the salt and the cold, and looked out at a horizon that was perfectly, terrifyingly flat. He called it Mar Pacifica, the peaceful sea. He thought the worst was over. He thought the Spice Islands were just a few days away. He had no way of knowing he had just entered the largest single feature on the face of the earth. The transition from the Strait to the Pacific was a psychological trap. After months of fighting gales and ice, the peaceful sea felt like a gift. The sun was warm, the winds were light, and the ships glided west with a deceptive ease. But as the weeks turned into months, the gift became a curse. The Pacific Ocean is an island of water so vast it could swallow every continent on Earth and still have room for more. Day after day, the sun rose and set on a world of nothing but blue. No birds, no clouds, no smell of earth, just the rhythmic, maddening creak of the timber. This is where the true deep dive into human endurance begins. The rations from the San Antonio were gone. The remaining biscuits had turned into a fine, gray powder crawling with worms. The water in the barrels turned yellow, then thick and ropey with slime. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler who watched it all, wrote that they were forced to eat the oxhide strips used to reinforce the masts. They would soak the leather in the sea for 4 days to soften it, then broil it over a small fire. They ate sawdust. They hunted the rats in the hold, which became so precious they were sold between starving sailors for half a gold crown each. Then came the gore filter of the age of sail. Scurvy. It began with a strange lethargy. Then the gums would swell until they turned black and grew over the teeth, making it impossible to eat even the sawdust bread. Old wounds, healed decades ago, suddenly broke open. Men who had survived battles in India died quietly in their hammocks, their bodies bruised and brittle. Every morning, the ritual was the same: a short prayer, a heavy splash, and another body committed to the silence of the deep. Magellan watched his crew wither. You see, the wise professor persona he projected was being tested to its breaking point. He spent hours with his charts, trying to understand why the world was so much larger than the books had said. He was sailing across a void that shouldn't exist. For 98 days, they saw nothing but two tiny, uninhabited specks of rock. The men were no longer sailors. They were ghosts navigating a dream. And then, on March 6th, 1521, a cry came from the masthead that didn't sound human. It was a raw, primal scream. Land, land. It was Guam. The blue desert had been crossed. They had survived the impossible, but they weren't the same men who had entered the strait. They were harder, hungrier, and carried within them a dangerous belief that they were now untouchable by God or man. When the 3 remaining ships drifted into the archipelago we now call the Philippines, the world seemed to wake up again. After months of nothing but the salt-bleached silence of the Pacific, the air was suddenly heavy with the scent of wet earth, blooming jasmine, and wood smoke. It was mid-March, 1521. Magellan's ships dropped anchor near the island of Homonhon. The men who went ashore didn't just walk. They knelt. They drank fresh water until they were sick and pressed their faces into the greenery. But Magellan was already looking ahead. You see, he had reached the far east by sailing west. He had done the impossible. And in that moment of triumph, something in his psyche began to shift. The wise professor was being replaced by a crusader. The encounter with the local people was, at first, a masterpiece of diplomacy. Magellan had a secret weapon, Enrique of Malacca. Enrique was a Malay slave Magellan had acquired years earlier in India. When the local boats approached, Enrique spoke, and to everyone's shock, the islanders understood him. For the first time in history, a human being had traveled so far in one direction that he had circled back to a language he knew. It was the ultimate proof that the world was a closed loop. Magellan soon met Raja Humabon, the powerful ruler of the island of Cebu. This wasn't a meeting of savages and civilized men. It was a collision of 2 sophisticated political worlds. Humabon saw the Spanish ships, their massive sails and thunderous cannons, as a technological wonder he could use to consolidate his own power over rival chiefs. Magellan, in turn, saw a harvest of souls. On April 14th, a massive wooden cross was planted in the center of Cebu. In a spectacle of smoke and incense, Humabon and hundreds of his people were baptized. To Magellan, this was his greatest victory. He believed he had brought the light of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church to the edge of the world, but behind this triumph lay a dangerous contradiction. By baptizing the King of Cebu, Magellan had made himself a participant in local blood feuds. He wasn't just an explorer anymore. He was an enforcer, and in the shadows of the neighboring islands, a warrior named Lapu-Lapu was watching, and he was not impressed by the strangers in their heavy steel clothes. The tragedy of Ferdinand Magellan didn't happen because of a storm or a mutiny. It happened because of a mistake in biomechanics and a surplus of hubris. Lapu-Lapu, the ruler of Mactan, refused to acknowledge the authority of the newly baptized Humabon, or the distant Spanish king. Humabon, playing a clever game, suggested that Magellan handle the rebel. Magellan, fueled by a sense of divine protection, agreed. He refused to bring his whole fleet. He didn't even want Humabon's warriors to fight. "Watch," he told them, "and see how we fight." On the morning of April 27th, 1521, Magellan led 60 men toward the shores of Mactan. But the geography of the island was his first enemy. The shore was guarded by a vast, jagged reef. The Spanish ships, with their heavy hulls and deep drafts, couldn't get close enough to use their cannons. The technological wonder of the fleet was rendered useless by a few hundred yards of shallow water. Magellan and his men were forced to leap overboard. Imagine the scene. Men in heavy steel breastplates and helmets, wading through waist-deep water under a blistering tropical sun. They were slow, they were exhausted before they even reached the sand, and waiting for them were 1,500 warriors who knew exactly how to fight in the surf. The gore filter of this battle isn't about the blood, it's about the weight. The Spanish fired their muskets, but the bullets spent their force against the wooden shields of the Mactan warriors, or missed in the chaos. Lapu-Lapu's men noticed that the Spaniards' legs were unprotected by armor. They began to aim low. Magellan was hit in the leg by a poisoned arrow. He didn't retreat. He stood his ground to cover his men as they scrambled back toward the boats. Then a bamboo spear struck him in the face. He tried to draw his sword, but a wound to his arm made it impossible. He fell into the shallow, red-stained water. There was no grand final speech. There was only the sound of the tide and the frantic splashing of his retreating men. The man who had survived the frozen wastes of Patagonia and the infinite silence of the Pacific died in a few inches of water because he forgot that even the most advanced technology is useless if you don't understand the ground beneath your feet. Lapu-Lapu refused to return the body, even for a mountain of trade goods. Magellan's remains vanished into the soil of the island he tried to conquer. He had found the way to the east, but he would never see the spices he had promised his king. Now the expedition was leaderless, bleeding, and surrounded by former allies who realized that the gods from the sea were very, very mortal. After the blood on the sand at Mactan, the expedition didn't just lose a leader, it lost its soul. The wise professor was gone, and in the vacuum he left behind, paranoia and betrayal flourished. On the 1st of May, 1521, Raja Humabon, the man Magellan had called brother, hosted a banquet for the remaining officers. It was a trap. By the time the screams died down, 27 of the fleet's most experienced men were dead. The survivors on the ships didn't wait. They weighed anchor and fled into the open sea. But they were now a skeleton crew. They had 3 ships, but only enough men to sail 2. And so, in a moment of grim necessity, they pulled the Concepcion into a quiet bay, stripped her of everything useful, and set her on fire. They watched as the ship that had carried them across the Atlantic turned into a pillar of smoke. It was a sacrifice to the gods of the voyage. Leadership now fell to Juan Sebastian Elcano. He wasn't a mystic like Magellan. He was a Basque sailor, practical, weathered, and deeply aware of the price of failure. He turned the 2 remaining ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, toward the south. In November, they finally reached the goal, the Moluccas. The islands were everything the rumors had promised, emerald gems rising from the sea, smelling of earth and fire. Here, the technological wonder of the Spanish world finally met the intellectual background of the East. They traded with Sultan al-Mansur of Tidore, filling the hulls of their battered ships with sacks of cloves. You see, at that time, a single sack of cloves was worth more than a man's life. It was a currency that could buy a palace in Spain. But as they prepared to leave, the Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, groaned one last time. Her hull was rotting from the inside. She couldn't make the journey. This was the final brutal split. The Trinidad would stay behind for repairs and try to sail back east across the Pacific, a journey that would end in capture and death for nearly all her crew. But the Victoria, under Elcano, would take the ultimate gamble. She would sail west through Portuguese-controlled waters all the way around Africa. For months, the Victoria became a ghost in the Indian Ocean. Elcano stayed far to the south, avoiding the shipping lanes where Portuguese patrols would have hanged them as pirates. The blue desert was replaced by a gray desert of storms and starvation. The cloves in the hold were a fortune, but the men on deck were eating their shoes. By the time they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the ship was a leaking wreck, held together by the sheer stubbornness of 18 men who refused to die. On September 6th, 1522, 3 years and several lifetimes after they left, the Victoria limped into Seville. The weight of gold in her hold was enough to pay for the entire 5-ship expedition and leave a profit. But as the 18 survivors stepped onto the quay, everyone knew that the real treasure wasn't the cloves. It was the fact that they had come back from the other side of the horizon. The men who returned didn't look like heroes. They looked like casualties. Their first act was to walk barefoot, holding candles, to the shrine of Santa Maria de la Victoria to give thanks for a life they had nearly lost 1,000 times. Juan Sebastian Elcano was granted a coat of arms by the king. It featured a globe with a simple Latin phrase, Primus circumdedisti me. You were the first to circumnavigate me. He had finished what Magellan started, proving through sweat and blood that the earth was a single continuous sphere. But what did this mean for the world? Before this voyage, the map was a work of fiction, full of monsters, and here be dragons. After the Victoria, the map became a tool of precision. The contrast of worlds was no longer a mystery. It was a trade route. The ocean was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. However, we must look through the rule of contrasts. This victory came at a staggering cost. 5 ships and 240 men left. 1 ship and 18 men returned. The historical mysticism of the voyage was built on the bones of hundreds. Magellan himself became a symbol of both the brilliance and the blindness of the age of discovery. A man who was right about the world, but wrong about his own place in it. The first circle was complete. The world had been measured. It had been touched. And as the survivors told their stories to the chronicler Antonio Pigafetta, they realized that while they had been sailing, the world back home had changed too. They had lost a day in their calendars because they had traveled with the sun, the first humans to ever experience the international dateline effect. The story of Magellan and the Victoria is a reminder that the greatest technological wonder isn't a ship or a compass. It is the human capacity to push into the dark, to endure the silence, and to keep sailing until the horizon finally brings you back to where you started. The world was finally won, and it would never be large enough to hide its secrets again.